Colin Currie. Welcome. Russ Hartenberger is putting together with Percussion. We're doing a project called Drumming at 50. And Russ asked me to do have a bunch of conversations with people, sort of in the style of the podcast I do called Concert Honesty, that is less of like a formal interview and more of a like, we're just going to chew the fat on drumming. And I've been speaking with a bunch of people who were in Steve's world. I spoke with Jay Clayton yesterday, who was in the Steve Reich Musicians, and I'm talking with Gavin Bryars at noon, who was in one of the original touring groups, the original performances of drumming. But you, with your group in England, have been sort of championing Steve's music in Europe in a really intense way. And Steve, intense, I mean in a really important, like, intense. You dig into Steve's music in the way that So does. We'll call that intensity. But you do it in your own way, and Steve has spoken of you very highly, and he sends his love, by the way. I just kind of curious, before we get into your current approach and just your thoughts around drumming, can we back up a little bit to like baby Colin and like for folks who, quite frankly, just to be full disclosure, you and I don't actually know each other that well. It's not like we've hung out in green rooms countless times, but your name and your name comes up enough.
Crossed, often,
But I feel like I know you, but let's pretend I don't at all. Can you tell me what got baby Colin, like, I know you're a drummer, but like, when did Steve Reich's music and drumming in particular sort of cross your field of vision for the first time?
Well, I think my first recollection of coming across his music was when the single page score of clapping music found its way into some youth orchestra, or rather that I was part of, the Edinburgh Youth Orchestra. So I would be very young, 12 or 13. And of course, I'd never seen anything like this. And I also actually had a stab at performing it. So that was certainly the first piece of Steve's that I would have performed. And then this was, this is showing my own particular era. This was the stage where I was buying my first CDs. There you go. So first compact discs.
BMG, something musical group, you'd pay like 13 cents and get 25 CDs in the mail, but then it cost my parents a lot more money because turns out it was a pyramid scheme. So,
Well done. Yeah, good for you. Yeah, that worked out for you. Probably.
That's how I got my first Weezer and Pearl Jam CDs, back in the day.
Yeah. Well, my first CD purchase was actually the complete works of Anton Webern, so that also explains.
Well, Colin, I'm going to call nerd alert on you there, buddy. Mine was Weezer and Pearl Jam, and you stuck with Webern. But look, we turned out okay.
Weezer. I like both those groups. That's fine.
We both turned out okay, so I'll give you a pass.
Yeah. And then so one of my first discs was, I suppose, like a lot of people, and maybe their first LP too back in that day. With someone with this kind of bent and interest in music, was the Music for 18 Musicians. Mm-hmm. And that I would have got heavily into in my mid-teens. And then I went on to discover works like Tehillim. And I think by the time I heard Tehillim, you could safely say that I was hooked. Mm-hmm. And this was when I was a student at Royal Academy of Music. And from there, I went on to investigate as much of it as I could. I bought all the catalog, everything I could find. And, I think then the seeds were sown of wanting to play this music. Although to play the larger works, certainly I would have to bide my time a little bit until the first opportunity came to perform drumming. As it turns out, I was asked to curate a Steve Reich event for the BBC Proms for his 70th birthday in 2006. And I was really given carte blanche for this. But the first work that I went to for the event was drumming, because it felt like it was the piece that I understood the least. And it was the one that really seemed to just beg sort of starting again. I really wanted to kind of just, in fact, go away from the recordings that were already in existence and just assemble my friends, my favorite players in my age group, and just begin it again if we possibly could, and see what would come out.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, it's interesting to me that you say drumming is the piece you knew the least, and I think as you say that, I'm just like, oh, he's a drummer. Why? And then I was like, well, wait a minute. Actually, before I played drumming, drumming was the piece I knew the least. Oddly, as percussionists, you don't start with the one piece that's all drummers.
Well,
like why is that? I don't know. Like for me,
Yeah.
sextet was the first piece I played of Steve's. It's like there's drummers in that, but there's something. There's pianos in that, I guess is my point. Like, not that those aren't percussion instruments, but drumming is the most sort of visceral drumming piece he wrote. That, and for some reason, you just don't. I didn't really play it till I joined So, to be quite honest.
Yeah. Well, I think furthermore, I don't know if I said it right or explained it. The main thing with this was I felt it was the piece that I understood the least.
Aha, got it.
And certainly when I got the score and the beautiful scrolly old score that there was at that time, I barely knew which way to hold it up.
I know.
So, and I thought, I really want to get into this. What's going on here? And where can we take this? Could this be a sort of a different version, or will we end up precisely as the piece always was? But I wanted to go through that journey, and as I say, with the musicians that I trusted most, my good friends, the inner circle of my percussion pals, and that was drumming. It just pulled like a vortex, pulled me in. Yeah.
Well, what were some of the things when you first picked it up that, like, when you say you understood it the least, what was it that you started to understand about it that you didn't prior to picking it up?
The overwhelming beauty of the thing, the structural integrity, the mathematical perfection, and just the sheer breadth of the piece. How on earth it could be that so much could be brought from such a focused, let's say, amount of material. I mean, it's one rhythm, really, not a whole lot of key changes, and the beauty of the piece in real time. Again, a bit like Music for 18, although of course different because of the phasing. It really exists in the moment. I mean. No two performances, of course, could ever be the same. And there's just that flexibility and that human element. So it's this perfect balance of this sort of scientific perfection and this beauty, sort of crystalline structure with this sort of sometimes unbearably profound human element. It's just glorious.
When you say mathematic and structural integrity, like I comes to mind to me when I think of, like, there's different versions of that, right? Like there's John Cage's, the square root formula is a version of structural integrity for him that allows a vessel to stand up with like on its own volition, right? Then you look at Xenakis, for example, and you look at Pleiades, and in particular, I know more about Poe than I do the other movements. I played them all, but like there's a different mathematical structural integrity that's happening there. That's harder, like you really have to squint at it to see it. But it's there, and everything stands on its own. Even the worst performance of Pleiades, somehow you're like, how this is so good that it somehow still works. But for you, what does that mean? I mean, I think my own version of that for drumming. But what is that? Where on the spectrum does drumming fall on that? That's because structural integrity is a spectrum. It's not. There's not one version of it. So for you, why does that hold so much weight for you?
I think. Just the intelligence with which, for example, if we would maybe just focus on part one, the intelligence with which the piece gradually kaleidoscopically turns, with each player with barely a postcard's worth of instructions. I mean, ultimately, it's a beautifully democratic piece with all the cogs in the wheel shared around, and everyone gets their moment in the spotlight, and at other times, maybe the majority of the time, sitting back. But I think it's the intelligence with which the music is allowed or perhaps forced to change at any given moment. I think again we see this incredible economy of the means to this astoundingly maximal effect. And I think that there's a mathematical beauty to be found in that. Stunning.
Yeah, again, it's like when I'm not like pushing for a specific answer here. Like to me, when I look at drumming, I feel like it's more of a there's an inevitability that comes, and that's reliant
Yeah.
on the performers to make a judgment as to when that inevitability has arisen. Like
Absolutely.
it's always there,
Yeah.
and your job is to recognize when the audience starts to like
Quite.
shift,
Yeah.
and it's like,
And,
oh, maybe wrap the phases up, bro, move it along, like
yeah.
maybe tomorrow that the audience will be wrapped, and you can sit in the middle of that first phase for a minute and a half, like Russ and Bob do every time they play that piece. Like
Yeah.
they break the mechanical rules of what phasing initially was, which is a constant movement. It's like, nope, they get to that middle and they just hang there for a minute and a half.
Yeah.
And that's a human thing, and I love that about the piece. But to me, of like Xenakis, you don't get to decide when that inevitability hits. When all of those drums start lining up and sort of and only hit together once in Poe, like really truly hit together once, that's his decision. That's not yours.
Quite.
With Reich, he gives you he just gives you enough rope to sort of like be dangerous with in that piece. And to me, that's where the structure. It's really reliant on you, Colin, to make Reich's inevitability happen.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think that's the beautiful threading of that needle, the mathematical with the human elements, I think in that regard, hard pushed to think of anything quite like it. That really makes it stand out.
Well, you mentioned we talked a little bit about the phasing, and this is sort of the like phasing is the one grenade in the room that every group has to deal with if they're going to play this piece, and you can sort of be like, oh, it's a means to an end, so it's not that big of a deal. Or you can be like, well, phasing is it's the gas pedal by which every car in this thing is sort of going to move in front of the other. So you can't like take the gas pedal out of the car. Like, okay, but the gas pedal is only this big, so let's maybe not put too much pressure on it. Like you have to make that call. I know I've been phasing for 16 years, and I still feel like I have to get back in bed with Jason and be like, how do we talk to each other again so we can go to sleep? Like, like for you. Yeah. And then it's like if I phase with Eric, it's like kissing a new dance partner all of a sudden, For you and your group in particular, what was the hardest part about putting the piece together that you still feel you haven't quite, like, is the hill you have to climb every time you do it?
Yeah, I mean, for all that I've already said that two performances couldn't be the same. I mean, I think the more we play it, the more we get close towards that sort of quintessentially and sort of delightfully out of reach ideal. And I think we all know, we all have a feeling, and it's been discussed too, I would say. We all have a feeling for those phases that we would want to be of a certain type. For example, if another famous place in the first part is when we all kind of, the whole thing breaks apart. I think it's often called the grand phase, where everything just jumbles around, and then three players come back together with player one before we start sucking the notes out of the phrase. That one, of course, we want that to be kind of wildly chaotic and rather long, and that one should be really confusing and somewhat alarming for the audience. I mean, we're very, very content with the idea of a little bit of anguish occasionally for the listener. It's an art
well,
piece.
It's a big like diminished seven chord that's got to go somewhere. Like it's headed somewhere.
Yeah,
you know
it.
Where it's resolving. Yeah. And it's your job to move that seventh down to the third of the root chord, but in terms of how you do that with a rhythm, like you have to control that, this attention and release.
Yeah. And then other ones we kind of just get it going. Some of the darker colors that we like to make in the first part when we're using the softer mallets, when there are just the three pitches going, the G sharp, A sharp, and the B, when that's kind of in this sort of a bit more controlled sort of territory, certainly the pitches and the colors somehow is this sort of darker, smaller space. Some of those phases we just kind of, come on, when we were first rehearsing, we're like, come on, just get through it. There's a few of them coming. It's quite a lot of phases in a row, which are a little trickier to discern. And those ones we just sort of, keep them sort of ticking over.
Maybe you should talk to Jason about that, because he has been making us, when we do that piece, those ones are the hardest ones. I play the steady part, the rock part. And in that part, at least the way we set up the drums, I'm now having to do a left-hand lead. And
and
you guys. And Jason, well, and we do, and so we've been trying to get better at those phases, and it's just like, can we just move through these? And I'm only saying that not even for a compositional reason. It's just like my own insecurity. Like, I don't want to be running naked through the park any longer than I have to be. And like those two particular phases for me are the hardest ones because they're soft and it's hard to hear articulation.
Yeah.
And it's a left-hand lead, and my left hand is a dummy. So maybe I should go. Steve talked a lot about stick control yesterday, and I was like, God, I should practice stick. If he's practicing it, so should I probably.
Yeah, all kudos to him. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, what in your putting together of drumming with your group? You said that you sort of like you may end up charting a similar course as everybody else did, but you wanted to figure out for yourself what might be new. Did you find anything new? Is there anything in your particular and I have to be honest, I haven't actually seen you all do all of drumming, and so I'm curious for you to tell me what might someone see in your version that might not be as evident in someone else's?
Oof. Well, I think it's a slightly I don't really know what word to use. We're hoping it's a very expansive version. So I'm reluctant to use the word heavy because I don't think it's like stodgy or inert in any way, but I think it's quite hard hitting, and we're not afraid to take it into the darker places. Steve once referred to it as being expressionist, which I thought was interesting. So maybe calling to mind a sort of weirdly, nicely warped European kind of darkness that certainly European in the sense of everything that happened with music in the 20th century that you could call to mind people like Wagner onto Bartók and Stravinsky, Shostakovich perhaps, and just that kind of expression, even someone like Schoenberg, just that whole area of music that went through this kind of so-called expressionist channel or rite of passage. At the same time, I think it's quite streamlined the way we play it. We're very resistant of any kind of overemphasis of the downbeat, which I know is not an original idea, but again, no such thing as original thought anyway.
Yeah, but it's interesting that you say that because playing it with Reich's group, have you played it with Steve before?
No, not with him.
I've been really lucky to play it with him 2 or 3 times now with Russ and a bunch of the guys from Nexus, and it's really. It's been like to me that's been the most like I mean I told Steve this like I feel terrible like every one of these interviews is going to have this story about like Gary Kvistad in it Bob Gary retuning these bongos. We played it with him at the Maverick Concert Hall in upstate New York where 433 was premiered, and it was like all of our SOCI students were there, and we get to the fourth movement in the show, F sharps are dinging, and Gary gets out his wrench and starts retuning the bongos because they're playing on these gone bops, with skinheads. And he's like, rip, 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 bum, 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 rip, 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 bum, 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 bum. And Steve is on stage going, sharp, flat, Gary, flatter, Gary, like, in a normal voice. And so, we're vamping on this F sharp for like 4 minutes. And I thought to myself, I was sort of like, does Steve know the piece? Does he know we're supposed to move on here? Like, what's happening? And I felt like, oh, they're people and this is a band. Like, this is what they've done for 50 years. Like, this is okay. Again, it's like I was talking with somebody about hearing a Japanese band play calypso music in Trinidad. Like, if they're accepting of it, why am I like, if the Trinidadians are cool with this, why am I sort of having any judgment on this? And it's like, oh, this is their music. This is allowed to happen. Like, I have I can't, it's not in the score, but I can't possibly judge this in any real way. And seeing that moment to me really blew my head open. Not to say like I want to take 4 minutes at the end of that third movement before we go back to the fourth movement, but to have a little bit less, like, to put it on less of a pedestal as this thing that must exist a certain way. Because like we were talking about the structural integrity, as far as I was concerned, Steve ruined the whole structural integrity of the inevitability of that piece, just deflated whatever he was like, sharp, Gary, like, but again, so that I have to question if he's not obsessed about that in that moment, and the pitches are more important. What does that mean for me as the performer? Anyway, I don't have a question there. It's just like that was a moment for me. It was like, oh man, Like I've been
Yeah.
obsessing about things that Steve maybe doesn't, and that's interesting to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he's always, we find him very, he's very punctilious, and the detail that he always brings to bear is fascinating. And I think
Hmm.
that's for us to then absorb, and then, if necessary, take it in our own direction, or just absolutely take it on wholesale and implement it. But I find him always very generous and
Yeah.
very honest. So it's been great, every piece that we've worked
Has
on him with.
what and again my podcast the premise of my podcast is called Concert Honesty, and it started with me being insecure about students thinking that I know what I'm doing, and so I just started going on Facebook and being like, well, just in case you think otherwise, today on this show I completely made up this part of third construction because I had a memory slip, and Jason distracted everybody with a cymbal crash and we got through it. Like, those sorts of things were important to me. And with drumming, I have enough stories where, somebody went around the horn on a phase and they had to go back around the
Oh
horn
yeah,
to get back. Like, I'm
yeah.
curious if you're willing to tell the listeners and quite frankly, any students who might be watching this who feel like they look at you as somebody who's on a pedestal who never makes mistakes.
Uh,
Is there any stories?
Please,
Is
yeah,
there, well,
yeah.
Colin, let's be clear. You're a very good drummer and percussionist, and I have that feeling about you some days. So this is mainly a question for me, maybe. But like, what horror stories do you have of performing drumming that I think actually made you better afterwards for having had to have gone through it?
Well, the first thing to say is that, very especially with this piece, this was no butterfly. I mean, I actually dread to think what it would have sounded like, our first performance of it. I mean, it's for sure. I know the kind of mallets we were using, and it's for sure we were not making an appropriate sound. It's for sure it wasn't very well balanced, and this we're still refining it. Our first performance of the work was back in 2006,
Hmm.
so it's starting to be quite a long time ago. 15 odd years ago, um, and yeah, I do recall that we've had some interesting moments in those long phases. And I remember there was a bit. I don't really want to say this because it's a little bit. It's not something that I was part of. I was just sitting back and observing. And there was a phase was going on, and another chap in my group who's very amusing, remain nameless. The phase was deemed to be complete, but it was incorrectly executed.
Hmm.
So this fella just shook his head. So they tried again, tried to phase again, and it lined up differently, but also wrong. So the same appraisal was given, but this time with a raised eyebrow. And then it was a third phase, and then yes, so that it was right, and then the piece could go on. So yeah, totally. I mean, we all, still doing that, still enjoying it. I mean, the mistakes are. I almost look forward to them now because, if you play a really great concert, of course it's a wonderful feeling, and it could be very good for the music you're doing. But did you learn anything from your great concerts? Not so much. So I embrace these moments, and it's important to sort of make friends with them. I think.
Did you learn anything from your great concerts? That needs to be on a T-shirt, like
Yeah,
because
I mean,
Go ahead.
yeah,
So, no, go ahead.
it's important to have them, and that's what we should all be striving for. But it's the ones where you fall off, where you think, oh yeah, I know why that happened. I'm not prepared, or I'm not comfortable with that bit, or wow, I need to slow that down again and change my sticking, or what could be a number of things. Or I should maybe have a couple of hours more sleep on this tour, or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I'm surprised. There's moments in drumming where because I play the rock part and I feel like I know what I'm doing, I will find myself like lost in thought for like 2.5 minutes where I was thinking about the recycling I needed to take out, and my computer crashed, and then 2 minutes goes by, a phase or two have happened, and I'm like, do I owe people like $15 back for that 2 minutes? Like, what? What did I do?
Yeah,
And I don't know what that's a
yeah,
sign of, but like
yeah,
the shaking off thing. Like the day before we recorded a video recording of drumming with Nexus for this project,
yeah,
we performed it live at Princeton, and at the end of the beginning of the second movement, the three marimba phase happens, and then there's just the rock
yeah,
part left before the
yeah,
second entrance. And Gary was coming in. Gary Kvistad was entering on that second marimba entrance, and so fades out, and and I look up at
yeah,
Gary, and in that phase, one had gotten turned around in his head, so he couldn't hear
yeah,
where he was hearing my C sharp as the downbeat rather than an E or
Oops.
whatever.
Yeah.
And he looked at me and he went like, and I felt like that. It's like that same thing as like a pitcher shaking off a pitch, like
Yeah.
to a catcher. You're like, bro, I got a fastball. That's all I got. All I have is like Steve only gave me one pitch, Gary. Like swing at it.
Yeah.
And he looked
Yeah.
over at Russ, and Russ was like, he looked over at Russ, and Russ started nodding the downbeat. And then Gary just was like, well, here I come. And he just came in, and we adjusted and we moved on. But again, like, I really want to be clear with anybody who's listening to this and has heard me tell that story now 5 or 6 times. This is not a comment on Gary. This is a comment on what it means to be a human being, playing a piece of music like Steve's, where your brain, our brains have not evolutionarily speaking gotten to the point where a phase can be rational.
Yeah.
We can play clapping music and just jump. That makes sense. But your brain is trying to make sense of chunks that are square. And, oh, that's a flower. Oh, that's the sunrise. And phasing is like the uncanny valley. Like you get in it and you're like, uh-oh, what I'm seeing isn't what I'm hearing. And that duality is something I think is really unique to Steve's music and will toy with you whether you're 69 years old or you're 13. And there's, I don't know, I haven't come across any music that quite does that like Steve, especially with drumming.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also a lot of it is in the hands of the gods, as it were. And again, that's a great thing. I mean, you could off you go in your phase, and you'll get through one. You think, yeah, that was good. That was nice and weird, and it lined up nicely and had a good groove. And the next one will just slip through your hands, and you'll think, well, not quite what I wanted, but next one. You just, and that's another thing about it is that human element. It is, it's natural to err,
right?
And that comes out in drumming.
How has, I mean, I want to ask you a little bit about your career as a player too here. Like if I'm on my deathbed and I'm breathing my last breath and someone says, quick, Colin Currie, I'm going to go solo concertos. Like that, whether you like it or not, that's the thing that's at the top of my head when I think Colin Currie. And that may not be accurate, but that's what I think. But it's also true. You do play a lot of solo concertos and you've had.
No, I'm happy to hear that actually. And if I was standing by your deathbed, you'd get a kiss.
I'll take it. I'll take a kiss from anybody these days. But how has playing a piece like drumming, which is there's not a solo. That's the anti-solo piece. How has playing a piece like that helped your solo playing, if at all? And if so, in what way?
More than I could ever explain. And then perhaps also vice versa on a good day. I think all these different experiences bring to bear on the others. I think with Steve's music, it's that what you learn from it and how you develop as a player when you play it is this grounding. It's very grounding music, and it's music that's earthy, and it connects you to the floor, to the space. It's very spiritual. It's very deep. It's big. So it's this sort of mindset that it puts you in. It's mind expanding. It's very focusing. Of course, it's really not particularly easy. And the tasks at hand are, they might be very, very focused and maybe limited in some ways, but that's not to say that they don't present enormous challenges. So I think anything as a player, anything that puts you out of your comfort zone is a great thing. And initially when I played Steve's music, and actually even a piece like when I first started playing Nagoya marimbas, playing the marimba 2 part especially.
The scariest piece of music ever written, by the way.
It's not easy.
It is the scariest 3.5 minutes of all written music.
the marimba 2 changing on a dime, all the sudden changes. I don't want to talk down marimba 1 either, but it's that changing on a dime, getting all those parts right. But it's good for you. It's like, eat your greens, and it improves you and it enhances. And I think anything like that adds to your
playing Nagoya is like having the greens blasted into your throat with a cannon, though. Like that's like you don't get to have like a fork and like a nice spoonful. Yeah. It's like you're drinking out of a fire hose. It's a gallon of
kale smoothie. That
right. You'll feel energized afterwards, but be a little sick to your stomach.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've really, really enjoyed taking that as a sort of holistic experience, and on some level, it rubs into my. Since you mentioned it, concerto playing, I would like to think I really would.
Yeah, I feel
Although, of course, it's a little hard to quantify.
yeah. There's not a direct one to one necessarily, but it is something that I think. I feel like the older I get, the more I feel like chamber music. I used to feel like it was like, oh, we're a team and we're just going to react to each other and like, oh, you'll do this and then I'll follow you. It's like that's true, but the older you get and the better you get at it, the more you realize it's like tandem skydiving, where you're trying to make a design in the air, and if somebody moves their hand slightly, the whole thing is gonna like go that way,
Lurch.
right? And so you
Yeah.
have to be very aware of everybody's like, oh, I saw Jason kick his left foot up 30 feet across the stage. I know that means that he's about to move out of the middle of his phase and head towards the next resultant. That's the cue for Jason. I know that cue. I know that hip movement and that shoulder look. And
Yeah.
I've only known that because I've jumped out of the airplane enough with him and we've hit the ground at 100 miles an hour because I missed that shoulder movement. Like that to me, that's the like the hyper awareness that I think drumming forces you into. That when we're playing Man Made or something with the LA Phil, I'm hyper aware. I have that same awareness. And I don't think I
Yeah.
had that prior to doing a piece like drumming.
Absolutely. Yeah. It definitely opens all your channels, and that's something you can bring with you, whatever you're doing.
What kind
No
of,
doubt.
again, you're somebody who has interacted with a ton of different audiences all over the world. What are some responses you've been getting from audience members who maybe just like they come to see, your name carries weight where somebody will come to see you play, even if you're just reading out of the phone book. So when somebody comes to see a show and maybe they're like have no idea who Colin Currie Group is and what Steve Reich or drumming is, what's some of the responses you've had, conversations you've had with just people who like for whom this is the first time they've ever heard something like this?
I mean, diverse. I mean, some people have found it challenging, uh, but seldom in a unedifying way. I mean, I've often tacked on Steve Reich works around my concerto performances. Actually, maybe hooking up with local percussionists, not always with my group, but with orchestral players, and we've played bits of Steve Reich here and there. And I think I'm such a ambassador. Real better word would be a believer. I'm such a believer in Steve's music, and the way it can alter your perception, and perhaps it maybe was crystallized in one event that we did, in which it was a festival in Germany in Ludwigsburg, and get this for a program. It was the Kalevi Aho percussion concerto played by me, which is a large work, 38 minutes,
Wait, who's the
huge
composer?
symphonic. Kalevi Aho, Finnish composer.
Okay.
One of my big hitters, sort of huge, dramatic work. However, with rather a quiet and atmospheric ending. And I had the group with me, and as this piece faded out, we had one player in the corner of the hall kick off music for pieces of wood. And then we gradually gathered, coming from different parts of the hall, and played out the first half of the symphony concert with music for pieces of wood. And at first there was, you could feel, it was, lights were down, but you could feel the rustling in the hall and a sort of disgruntled maybe people, but it settled down. And this is the key. I'm not afraid of ruffling feathers. Neither would Steve be. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that's great. I mean, you're getting the reaction of the crowd. Fantastic. You're more than halfway there. But by the end of the work, the place was wrapped, and there was so much tension. Like, how on earth is this going to end? What will bring it to an end? And we do a very poker faced ending. Just lights out kind of ending.
So do we.
Yeah. And brought the house down. So this was very interesting. The second half was even more out of the box, perhaps, because it was drumming part one segued into Beethoven 5. So we finished part one, large crescendo, digga 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 digga, ba 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 ba, and there it was. The conductor was on the box, and then we just walked off stage and went our own way. But I thought this was an interesting bit of programming, and drumming part one was not out of place, and a seriously brain opening idea and piece of music to have before the opening of perhaps the most best known symphony of all time. Really
Based
worked.
on one rhythm.
There you go. Yeah, I mean,
You know, three notes in a row. Ba,
yeah,
ba, or four notes in a row, excuse me. Ba 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 ba.
yeah,
Like that,
yeah,
you know, just
yeah.
the
Digga
idea
dum dum.
that you can build a piece off of
Yeah,
one idea. And then how you know, obviously Beethoven doesn't use phasing, but you know, how he displaces that around the orchestra, like
yeah.
that.
Rhythmic component for a piece. You know, a single gesture made to maximum effect. I mean, where have we said that already today? You
I've
know,
been
Beethoven
shocked.
Five.
I've been shocked too about the reaction to music for pieces of wood when we do it live. You know, and again, like I am someone who I'm just going to be honest. Like you know, performing minimalism to me is way more fun than listening to it. That's just me personally. I have a blast playing it. It's not that I don't
Mm,
enjoy listening to it. If I had the choice, if I always had the choice, I'd be like, oh yeah, I'll play it. You know, like to me,
yeah,
that's
I'd be itching to play too. Yeah,
yeah.
sure.
But I always play it, and I always am just like I'm so focused, I'm doing my thing, and then I look up, and I'm always surprised when people are so enthused, and I don't know why I'm enthused. I'm just like, you're enthused about this. This is all we did was okay. Like that's my reaction every time. But there's something about I don't know whether it's like the holding of that tension, and then the TV flips off, and
Yeah,
there's something about that like the bottom dropping out that I think people react to in a very visceral way. And I don't know, just to say I'm always shocked that Pieces of Wood gets the reaction. Sometimes the reaction is more excitement than like Mallet Quartet gets, or something
yeah.
that to me feels way more ecstatic and way more of a tension and release, you know, because there's
Mm,
harmonic tension and release. Not that there isn't in
yeah,
Pieces of Wood, but it's a way more functional harmonic release
yeah.
in Mallet Quartet than it is in drum, or than it is in Pieces of Wood. And even in a piece like drumming is not like it does the thing that Steve does, which is you start to climb and register, right?
Hmm.
And you thin out the texture to where you're basically just open fifths or fourths. Sextet does this. Everything climbs and then it clears out, and that's
Yeah,
like Steve's 5/7. We know Steve's coming towards the one chord, and we're going to end here soon. But drumming does that at the end of the third movement, and then it comes back and goes back to maximal density again, like,
yeah,
which is an interesting just compositional technique of Steve's that you hear in '71 and you hear it now in 2019 when he's writing new pieces. You hear that same little drumming thins out to just an F sharp.
yeah,
And as far as Steve is concerned, that's like a signal of like, that's all. And then what does he do? He just puts everything back together that he had already
yeah,
done the first three movements. You know, it's almost
yeah.
like if you didn't know, you could be like, well, did Haydn write this? That's like a very,
Absolutely. Yeah,
very classical approach to an ending. I
it's
would
the
never say that to
finale. You
Steve's
know.
face because he might yell at me, but it's just an interesting, like, calling balls and strikes. It's just interesting to see that that's how he chose to skin that particular cat.
Yeah, but I also think it's wonderful. Part four of drumming. Even if you didn't have even if you didn't know there were four parts, I think once, especially once the singers and piccolo are in, you could see, and well, you can feel, you can hear, but you can also see in a concert. Everyone's playing now,
Yeah. Right.
and of course, I think you would just know instinctively, even if you would not say it to yourself or express it in words. You would know this is the last 2 minutes of the piece.
Well, it's
There's no
like,
doubt.
yeah, I mean, again, I was talking with
Yeah.
Steve yesterday too about this. It's like when you watch a group of human beings do anything, you can tell when the last 2 minutes of a playoff basketball game is happening. You don't even need to see the timer. You can turn it on and you can just see the energy in the room is different than it is in the first 2 minutes of the game.
Yeah.
And with live performance, and I think this is whether you're playing John Cage's music, Schoenberg's music, or Caroline Shaw, or Steve Reich, you can tell when the end is there because the energy is different. And I think especially in drumming, it's like it's palpable.
Yeah.
In the same, and it ends in the same way that Pieces of Wood does. Like it's just the engine is running, and then it's just like boop,
Yeah.
the TV's off. You know.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious.
Out of data.
Yeah, yeah, I'm out of data.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Colin. Just two final questions, and then I've stolen enough of your time here. What for you? Let's pretend this is the Ghost of Christmas Future here. Like let's remove drumming. Maybe not all of Steve's music, but just drumming in particular. Let's somehow take that out of your life. You never decided to play it. You just went the solo career path. maybe you do some other chamber music, but like drumming just never made it into the mix. What, knowing what you know now, how would your life be different? And I'm not asking for like, oh, I'd be in the gutter in despair, like I'd be horrible, but like what people might not be in your life? How might you feel rhythms differently? Like anything like that. If drumming wasn't in your life, what might you observe?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a big drumming shaped hole. I mean, I think that work certainly was the piece that led to the foundation of my group, which is very much devoted to Steve's music. So that ensemble, yeah, it may not have been formed. That must be said. Is that drumming was certainly the work that kicked the whole thing off and led me to one day call my agent and said, you know what, this is now going to be a thing, and we're doing this, and this is what we're going to do. We'll start with drumming, and then the next thing, Holy Grail piece would be music for 18, and then we'll take it from there. And by the way, would maybe Steve write something for me? And that led to the world premiere of Quartet, and then other new work next year. So you could start to question whether or not Quartet would have been commissioned. That's very possible that would not be in existence. Would be very sad. So I think it's that kind of thing. So in terms of Steve Reich's music, drumming was this huge way in to his oeuvre. And then musically speaking, I'm sure it's grounded me and made me think about groove, placement, tempos, and also pitching pieces correctly to the hall you're in. Because if ever there was a time to play a piece for the space, it's drumming. I mean, we've played it in small halls, we've played it in big halls, we've played it hugely amplified, we've played it almost acoustically, everything in the middle. And I think that's really made me think urgently about playing any piece appropriately for the space. And I think that internal conversation arose very much from drumming and playing Steve's music. So I think those are the things that spring to mind.
That's really interesting. I would love when you mentioned playing things appropriate to the space. I had this image of I think was it the Met Opera or somewhere where it was in Vienna, where they had the concert hall filled with trees. Rather than audience members, and I was like, I would love to play drumming in there for a bunch of trees. I think that would just be almost
full circle.
Yeah, I wonder if that would be better than playing it for people. That's an open question I have. I would love to test that theory out of mine. Final question for you, Colin. What advice do you have for students who maybe for whom this is their first time hearing about Steve Reich drumming? Maybe they don't know anything about it. Why would you say, hey, I would never say somebody is required to play drumming in order to be a happy human being. I would never say that. But I would say, if you do play drumming, here's why I think you should do it and what you might get out of it. Just as a place to start, to push somebody out on the raft of Reich's music for the first time.
Yeah.
Why would you recommend that to somebody?
Because it's beautiful, first and foremost. It's beautiful. But it's edifying, and it will challenge you, and it will better you, and it will make you a better team player, a better listener, a better thinker, a better integrator. And all these things are so essential with music making, not just in chamber music, but anything that you may be doing, playing in an orchestra or whatever it may be. I think it's a humbling experience because it's so brilliant and so, again, back to what we said at the beginning, it's so perfectly organized. This balance of the number game versus pouring your heart out into this piece. It's just a sort of beautiful, complete musical experience, and it just expands you. And every time I feel truly every time we play it differently, and we improve ourselves, and it's humbling. And I think that's key. It's very, very important to keep those kinds of experiences which let you know your place. The music is always bigger than you, and drumming will do that for you no matter how many times you play it.
I think humbling I think the world needs a bit of
Yeah, a bit humble. Wouldn't hurt right now.
It might be nice. Well, Colin, this has been really great, and I'm very grateful for your time, and I hope
Sure thing, man. Yeah.
I desperately want to get in a proper pub with you and have an ale, and
it's going to happen. 2020 or nothing. It'll happen.
Have an ale or five to sort of catch up in person. And I really look forward to doing that in person. But Colin, thanks again. Stay safe, stay healthy, and if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I'll look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Colin.
Cheers, man.
Cheers.